Welcome to Lesson 7 in 215 Advanced Behavior Management and Programming. One of the most important things for us to recognize is that the very first time we're going to become aware of the need for a behavioral change is after we've observed a behavioral problem. It could be that the person has done something that's challenging or that they haven't been doing something that's important and constructive in their lives. So the very first set of skills we need to use are called reactive strategies, and we have to make sure that we use them well. These reactive strategies are designed to limit any harm that might come from the problem behavior, to minimize, and to get the person back on track as quickly as possible. But reactive strategies do very little to create change in the long term. And instead of making our strategies all about how to react, we need to evolve and move towards what we call proactive strategies. In other words, reactive strategies are a good thing, but they're not the only thing we need to do. That being said, this video will take a look at some of the important things we need to remember whenever we're implementing reactive strategies. So the first rule for reactive management is that we stay calm. Remember that your interactions need to be planned and deliberate. You need to be able to think. And we know from what we've learned in our module on crisis intervention that the more a person becomes emotionally aroused, the less rational they're going to be. And that's true of staff, not just people we support. If you're required to intervene or interact, it's also going to be important for you to have a presence that communicates to your coworkers and to the supported individual that you are poised and in control. People are much more likely to respond in the way you want them to if it looks like you have those ingredients. And if you have a strong emotional response, it's very, very common for that strong emotional response to become reinforcing to the individual, even if that's not what they were originally looking for. That motivational shift we spoke of before can occur, and the person's behavior can sometimes be inadvertently reinforced. In other words, we can accidentally strengthen it. So the other thing we need to remember is the more calm we are, the more likely we are to be effective as we communicate, both with the person and with others who are going to be needed in supporting this reactive strategy. It's also critically important that we assess, and people often think they don't have the time to do that, but it doesn't necessarily take a lot of time to assess. Even if we've just come across something unexpected, usually a second or two can tell us a lot. Because there are many, many choices that we can make in these circumstances, but in my experience, only a few of them are going to actually make things better, and the vast majority of things are going to make things worse. And also, I should mention, there are very few responses that will be in between that. There's almost nothing you can do that will have no impact at all. A lot of our responses will worsen the behavior. So understanding the need behind the behavior is essential if we're going to pick the right tool. What we can do is learn to do things with a beat in between. And often to us, it feels like an eternity in our response. But only a second or two can often be the difference between us making an irrational or reactionary choice and making a strategic reactive choice. The other thing we want to do is consult with our team, defer to people who seem to have more success with this individual or more experience or a better relationship. And over time, we will often collect data. We want to compile that data, make sure that it's collected in a way that's rigorous and we'll call it pure and clean, so that we know that the data is actually going to tell us a reliable story, but really rely on those processes. I think a lot of times working in our sector, people think it's beyond their pay grade or their expertise to get out a clipboard and a piece of paper and start taking down data. But not only is that not simply accurate, it really is part of our job to do this, but frankly, not doing that will make us be in circumstances that are far more challenging and far more dangerous because we're simply going to not know the right thing to do. The next rule is to choose the right tool. And in this video, I'm going to give a very brief summation of these tools because we've covered them elsewhere. But by now, you should start to have a basic understanding of some of the tools in the reactive strategy toolkit. One of them is called extinction. And sometimes people think this behavior is actually ignoring people, but that's not quite what it means. When we use extinction or extinguish, what we do is remove the possible reward or stimulus in some cases for the individual. If they're looking for attention from somebody, then the person that they're looking for that attention from might turn and walk away or use body language to communicate that they're not going to respond to the type of behavior that's being used. But this is, even when it's not attention-seeking behavior, possible. For example, if an individual is trying to grab something from somebody, simply taking that object out of the line of sight can sometimes make a difference. I am not a fan of referring to this as ignoring a person. If you're removing attention, we're not ignoring the person as a whole. We're simply not responding to the specific undesired behavior. And this is a critical distinction because first, we need to continue to observe the person. Maybe it's through a mirror or the corner of our eye or just using our ears, but we still certainly need to be aware of what that person is doing and being able to respond whether the behavior worsens or, even more importantly, when it improves. Because often, as soon as that person shifts their behavior, if they, for example, stop doing the troublesome behavior and start doing the desired behavior, we want to immediately respond to the desired behavior by giving them the very thing that they were looking for, in this case, attention. Another tool is satiation. Satiation is not used as much as you might think. It basically means giving the person what they're looking for until they get tired of it. And this can be sometimes effective, but at other times it doesn't really work because the person seems to have a bottomless appetite for the thing. So sometimes we do this by letting the person just kind of continue on and on and on, and it can look like extinction. It doesn't matter whether or not you remember the terminology. If you're using a tool that looks like you're letting the person get it all out, then you're probably using satiation. Redirection is a very common reactive strategy. Here, you're simply directing the person to something that you think will work better for them. And we've talked about this many times. You can redirect them to something that will be a functional alternative, a new behavior that will meet their needs better, such as if the person is hitting themselves, getting them instead to go and hit a punching bag. Or something that's incompatible, a behavior that can't be done at the exact same time. For example, if a person is hitting themselves and you got them to carry bags of groceries, very unlikely they could do those two behaviors at the same time. The best situation is when we find something that is both functional and incompatible. A person is hitting themselves, we assess and we think that person is really angry and that person needs to ventilate, so we let them go out and shoot basketball hoops. When they're doing that, that energy is both functional for them, and the activity of holding a basketball and shooting a basketball is incompatible with hitting themselves. Sometimes people are not able to do the more typical form of a behavior. For example, if a person can't speak, asking them to use their words as a functional alternative doesn't work. But we can create what are called functional equivalents for those people. So for example, we mentioned in a previous video, if a person can't verbalize that they want to take a break, perhaps we create for them some kind of equivalent, like a card that they can give us when they want to use that, take that break. And sometimes we can do something called assigning meaning. And what this means is simply that we as a staff team gather around a person and come up with what we consider to be a clear definition of certain behaviors. So that if a person starts to stand up and walk outside to the hallway, it means that they want to go to the bathroom or that they want a break. Or if a person put their headphones on, we all perceive that as meaning the individual is feeling overwhelmed. There are lots and lots of examples of this. Applying consequences can be a tool that we use in terms of reactivity. Letting people know that there's a logical or natural consequence to their behavior is not unethical, and sometimes it's very effective. For example, if an individual takes their food and throws it on the floor when they're angry, it's a natural consequence that their food is no longer there. And I would be very careful about removing that consequence for people. There are circumstances where I could imagine doing that, but there are other circumstances where I would want the person to experience that consequence as a fast way of shaping their behavior. And make sure that you're not using consequences that you feel are good because they're emotionally satisfying for you, like giving punishments or strong emotional reactions, because as I've mentioned many times, those are often actually going to inadvertently reinforce the person. Cues and prompts, reminding people to try something new or asking them whether or not what they're doing is working for them, can be useful. Vicarious reinforcement. This means that we give other people in the environment rewards for the behavior we want to see. And when that person who's misbehaving sees it, they will want to join in. Managing the audience or environment. If people are doing behavior that is about getting a strong response from the members of the community or the public around, then sometimes having those members of the community or public leave can change everything. If you were an actor on a stage and the entire audience got up and left the stage, would you continue to act? And so this can be a really powerful tool. And sometimes, plain and simple, we just literally do nothing. And I can think of a couple of circumstances where this is the case. I've worked with individuals who had so many different behavioral challenges that if we reacted to every single one of them, we would have spent all of our day being upset or seeming to be upset with an individual. So instead, we focused only on the things that were a big deal, and later on, we got to the second and third tier issues. Sometimes it's not that that happens every day, but you might notice that a person's had a bad day, and you just need to let some things go on that day. The second circumstance is that sometimes the thing takes care of itself. If, for example, a person is tapping you on the shoulder and wants your attention, sometimes the simple thing to do is just keep walking, and that takes care of itself. The person realizes that it just didn't work. That is not a dysfunctional response, that's a non-functional response. And people stop using things that don't work for them. These tools can be used in combination, and that's an important thing to understand. The calmness we spoke about earlier is really going to be important in the delivery of this. The assessment is really going to be important in determining how and when these things can be done and how they can be done together. And often we get to the point where we literally come up with scripts and steps to make sure that we're all doing the same thing and all having the same sort of calm, neutral presence as we do it. We need to make sure as well that we communicate when we're doing this work. We need to work as a team and make sure that we don't have inconsistencies that can cause frustration or exploitation by the supported individual. Even people with profound intellectual disabilities will start to notice those inconsistencies, and it will really slow down any behavioral progress if things are working with one person and not working with others. If you are personally having difficulty, it's really important to use your communication skills to communicate that and get some respite, get somebody else to take over. This tag team approach can be really important because if you're going to start to lose your cool, then you don't want that to happen. Things can fall apart at that point. And it's really good to ask other people to step in those moments and to be there when other people do that for you. You really want to take a look at who has the best relationship with an individual and see if they can be the person who intervenes, especially in the early going of reacting to challenging behavior. So those strong relationships are important resources. And be really strategic in responding to clients. Think about what's going on for that person emotionally. If you start applying consequences, for example, to somebody who's emotionally aroused, they're not going to work the same way as they might when that person is back in a calmer state. Instead, they're going to backfire because they're going to be too much input for that person. So you really have to stop and think about the when and the how that you deliver those techniques. It's not just that the method is actually going to be used, but the when and the how make a big difference. And we also have to make sure that we plan for the future. So when we do something that's a reactive strategy, it's also a data collection opportunity. We get to see whether or not the things that we have intended to use are actually being done correctly and whether they're working. So sit down and see after you've used these procedures whether they actually worked. Also, if you come out of this picture, out of these situations, thinking to yourself, maybe there's more going on for the person than we might recognize. Maybe new evidence begins to emerge, for example, that the person has some psychiatric issue or some medical issue underlying what's going on. We can always decide to go and do further assessment of the person's needs. Often it's really important for staff people to simply get more clear on the procedures they're supposed to use, especially if they aren't used very often because the person's doing really well and making progress, or if people are new to the team. It often gets overlooked that we haven't trained people or that we haven't actively practiced. And I think in quiet moments or in staff meetings, it's a great idea for us to actually practice role-playing how we might say and use these tools, or even creating video so that new people can see what they sound like and look like to be used correctly. And of course, don't just stop when you have these reactive strategies. It's incredibly common for me in my career to be asked to come in and come up with a crisis intervention plan for people who have very challenging and often aggressive behavior. But often those teams don't understand that it's neither ethical or effective to simply focus on what we're going to do when the person misbehaves. That approach guarantees that the person is going to continue to misbehave, and almost always that they're going to misbehave in ways that intensify. They get more frequent or get harder to deal with. So if we don't stop and think about how to turn the tide and how to progressively make things better, we're simply going to be ineffective in that person's life. So it's a challenging conversation to have with people sometimes, but that's because they often think they're too busy to do things that are proactive, or they don't understand that they can, or that these are effective tools. We may need to be advocates for turning away from a purely reactive approach and focusing on proactive strategies. All right, that's going to wrap up this video. Moving into the next videos, we're going to start looking at some specific types of behavior and some examples.